She was standing at the kitchen sink when she first understood what she had married. Not who she thought she knew who. She had known Jim Jones since she was 17 years old, had married him at 22, had spent the intervening years building something with him that she believed in with the particular depth of conviction that comes from having sacrificed for a thing. She believed in the mission. She believed in the community. She believed, or had believed for a very long time, in the man. But on a Tuesday afternoon in 1963, standing at the kitchen sink in their home in Indianapolis while Jim Jones was in the living room doing something she was not supposed to see, Marceline Jones understood, with a clarity that she would spend the next 15 years trying to understand, exactly what kind of man she had agreed to spend her life with. What she saw through the half-open door was not violence. It was not abuse. It was something quieter and in some ways more disturbing, something that told her, in a language that required no words, that the person she had believed Jim Jones to be was a performance, and that the performer had been watching her believe it for years, and that the performer found this useful. She closed her eyes. She turned back to the sink. She kept washing the dishes. And she never said a word about what she saw. Not that day. Not that year. Not for 20 years, through Indianapolis and California and Guyana and the building of a community that would eventually consume 918 lives including her own. She kept washing the dishes. That is where the story of Marceline Jones begins. Not with Jonestown. With a kitchen sink and a choice that was made so quietly it barely registered as a choice at all. If you have ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have. If you have ever known something you could not afford to know, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because that is the story this channel tells. Not just what Jim Jones did. What it cost the people closest to him to know it. Marceline Baldwin was born in Richmond, Indiana, in 1927. She was the daughter of a Methodist family, raised with the particular combination of moral seriousness and practical warmth that the Methodist tradition at its best produces. People who believe that faith without works is empty, that the measure of a life is what it does for others, that comfort is something you earn by having been useful. She was, by every account of people who knew her as a young woman, genuinely good. Not performatively good, not good in the way of someone who was managing an image. Actually good, in the way that requires no audience and no recognition. She trained as a nurse. She worked in hospitals. She cared for people who were suffering with an attentiveness that her colleagues remembered decades later. She met Jim Jones in 1948 when she was 21 years old. He was 20 years old, already preaching, already magnetic, already the kind of person who filled whatever room he entered with a quality of presence that people struggled to describe and could not stop noticing. He was also, even then, genuinely committed to racial equality in a way that was both unusual and, for Marceline, immediately compelling. Jones preached to integrated congregations at a time when that was dangerous. He brought black and white families together in a city where they did not eat in the same restaurants. He had, or appeared to have, the courage of his convictions in a form that Marceline had not encountered before. She fell in love with the courage first. The man followed. They married in 1949. She was 22. He was 21. She converted from Methodism to his evolving theology without apparent difficulty. The core of what Jones preached in those early years was not far from what she already believed, a Christianity that emphasized justice and community and the obligation of the strong to protect the weak. She threw herself into the work of building what would become People's Temple with the same attentiveness she had brought to nursing. She organized. She administered. She managed the details of a growing community while Jones managed its soul, which meant that she knew, from the beginning and with a precision that Jones's public followers never had, exactly how the organization functioned, where the money went, what the gap was between what Jones said in public and what was decided in private. This is the part of Marceline Jones's story that history tends to compress into a single convenient characterization. Victim, enabler, true believer, because the truth of it is more uncomfortable than any of those categories can contain. Marceline was not naive. She was not uninformed. She was not a woman who loved a man blindly and found out too late what he was. She found out early. She found out incrementally, over years, in the way that you find out about someone you are living inside a life with. Not through dramatic revelations but through accumulations, through small moments that don't quite add up, through the gradual recognition that the person you married and the person you live with are not entirely the same person. The fake healings began in the late 1950s. Jones had started staging miraculous cures during services, cancer supposedly dissolving, paralysis suddenly reversing, the blind recovering their sight. The mechanics of these performances required preparation, required props, required the cooperation of people who were told they were serving a higher purpose by participating in a deception that Jones insisted produced real faith even if the miracles themselves were manufactured. Marceline knew. She knew because she was a nurse and the miracles did not survive medical scrutiny, and she knew because Jones did not keep the backstage entirely hidden from her. She confronted him about it. Exactly once, by every account. Jones explained to her, in the particular way that Jones explained things to people he needed to keep close, not with anger but with certainty, with the logic of a man who had already decided the argument and was simply walking her through his conclusions. That the healings served the community, that the people who experienced them were genuinely helped, that the empirical truth of whether a miracle occurred was less important than the truth of what the miracle produced in the believer. Marceline listened. She did not agree. And she did not bring it up again. This is the pattern that runs through 20 years of marriage to Jim Jones. Marceline sees. Marceline objects once, if at all. Jones explains. Marceline absorbs the explanation without accepting it and without continuing to resist it. And the organization keeps growing, and the community keeps deepening, and the sacrifices accumulate, the time, the money, the friendships outside the temple that slowly atrophy because the temple consumes everything, and each sacrifice makes the next one easier to accept because the alternative to accepting it is to admit that the previous sacrifices were made for something that did not deserve them. This is not weakness. This is the mathematics of sunk cost operating on a person who was also, genuinely, committed to the good that People's Temple was doing alongside the bad. Because the bad was never all there was. The food programs were real. The racial integration was real. The elderly members who were cared for with genuine dignity were real. Marceline had given years of her life to those real things, and the real things were inseparable from the man who had built them, and the man was inseparable from the things that were not real, and so she kept washing the dishes. By the late 1960s, Jones's drug dependency was established enough that Marceline could not have missed it even if she had wanted to. She was a nurse. She understood what she was seeing. The stimulants, the sedatives, the painkillers, the combinations that varied by day and by need and that were producing, in the man she lived with, a personality that was becoming increasingly difficult to predict. There were nights of extraordinary clarity and warmth, nights when Jones was the person she had married, present, funny, genuinely tender, capable of the kind of conversation that had made her fall in love with him. And there were other nights. Nights that she described to a therapist in San Francisco in 1974, in sessions that she attended alone and that Jones did not know about, as nights when she was not sure who she was talking to. When the man in the room with her was a version of Jim Jones that she did not recognize and that frightened her in a way she had no language for. The therapist's notes from those sessions were never made public. But a colleague of the therapist, speaking years after Jonestown, described the broad shape of what Marceline had discussed. She was not, the colleague said, trying to decide whether to leave. She had, by that point, already decided that leaving was not a real option, not because she was afraid for herself, though fear was present, but because of the community. Because 900 people had organized their lives around something she had helped build, and walking away from it felt to her like abandonment, like a betrayal of the people who had given everything they had to a project that she had endorsed with her presence and her labor and her name. She was, the colleague said, trying to find a way to manage what she knew. To keep functioning inside a situation she understood clearly and could not change and could not leave. She was trying, in other words, to keep washing the dishes. She tried to get Jones to slow down. She tried to get him to reduce the medications, to sleep more, to delegate, to step back from the absolute centrality he had placed himself at inside the organization. These conversations happened, by the accounts of people who were near enough to witness them, with a regularity and a futility that exhausted her. Jones listened. Jones agreed. Jones changed nothing. And Marceline, having said what she needed to say, went back to the work of managing the community that existed in the gap between who Jones told the congregation he was and who she knew him to be. In 1977, when the decision was made to move the core of People's Temple to Jonestown in Guyana, Marceline did not want to go. People close to her at the time say this plainly. She did not want to go. She raised objections. She understood that the move to an isolated settlement in a foreign country was not the expansion of the mission it was being described as, but something else, something she did not have a clean word for. She went anyway. Because the community went. Because Jones went. Because 28 years of marriage and 28 years of shared work and 28 years of choosing, every time the choice presented itself, to stay rather than go had built a gravity that was by that point very nearly irresistible. In Jonestown she worked. She ran the medical clinic. She cared for residents with the same attentiveness she had brought to everything in her professional life. People who were there in those final months describe her as the most stabilizing presence in the settlement, calm, competent, genuinely caring, the person you went to when something was wrong and you needed someone who would actually listen. She fought, in the ways available to her, against the worst of what Jones was imposing on the community. She pushed back against the harshest punishments. She advocated for residents who were being treated in ways that she found indefensible. She did what she could within a structure that she had helped build and that was no longer in her control and had perhaps never been. On the night of November 18, 1978, Marceline Jones died in Jonestown at the age of 51. She was found near the pavilion. She had not fled. She had not attempted to use the medical knowledge she possessed to survive what she understood was coming. She died alongside the community she had spent her adult life serving, beside the man she had married when she was 22 years old, in the jungle settlement that was the final consequence of every choice and every silence and every morning she had turned back to the dishes and kept going. History remembers her, when it remembers her at all, in one of two ways. Either as a victim, a good woman destroyed by a bad man, a nurse who got caught in something larger than herself. Or as an enabler, someone whose silence and compliance made possible things that her resistance might have prevented. Both of these are partially true. Neither of them is sufficient. Because what Marceline Jones actually was, across 28 years of marriage to Jim Jones, was something that has no clean name in the vocabulary we use to talk about people who stay in situations they understand to be wrong. She was a person who knew. Who chose, every time the choice presented itself, to stay and to manage rather than to leave and to expose. Who believed, perhaps, that her presence was protective, that the community was better with her in it than without her. Who may have been right about that? Who paid for being right, if she was right, with everything she had? The dishes are never just dishes. That is the thing the story of Marceline Jones leaves behind. The small daily choice to keep going, to keep functioning, to keep doing the work in front of you rather than the harder work of naming what you know, the choice, made once, is understandable. Made every day for 20 years, it becomes the architecture of a life. Becomes the reason 900 people followed a man into a jungle. Becomes the silence in which a community built itself and then, in 44 minutes, unmade itself. Became, in the end, everything. She knew. She stayed. And we are still asking why, because the answer, the true and uncomfortable answer, is not about Marceline Jones at all. It is about every person who has ever known something they could not afford to know, and turned back to the sink, and kept going. There is a photograph of Marceline Jones taken in Jonestown in the months before the massacre. She is standing outside the medical clinic in a white nursing uniform, looking directly at the camera. She is not smiling, but her expression is not unhappy, it is the expression of someone who is busy, who has agreed to be photographed for a moment and is waiting to get back to work. Behind her, through the clinic door, supplies are organized on shelves with the precision of someone who takes care seriously. The clinic is, by every account, the best-run thing in Jonestown. Marceline made it that way. That photograph tells you everything the historical accounts tend to obscure. Not because of what it shows, a woman doing her job in a place that would kill her, but because of what it does not show. The weight of 20 years of knowing. The specific exhaustion of a person who has spent 2 decades managing the gap between what she understands and what she can say. It shows the surface, which was composed incompetent and genuinely caring, and hides the interior, something that required 28 years to build and 44 minutes to end. She was a nurse her entire adult life. She understood, better than almost anyone in Jonestown, what cyanide does to a body. And she stayed. She died and left behind no final statement, no letter, no recording of the things she knew that she never said. Just the clinic with the supplies organized on the shelves. Just the silence that had been building for 20 years and that ended, on November 18, 1978, in exactly the way that 20 years of managed silence tend to end, not with the words that were never said, but with the accumulated, irreversible weight of having never said them, in a jungle, at 51 years old, beside the man she had chosen at 22. The people who knew her best in those final months describe her in almost identical terms. They say she was kind. They say she was calm. The person you went to when you needed help, who always helped. Fundamentally good, not performatively, but actually. And they say, almost without exception, that there was something in her eyes in those final months they could not name at the time. Something that looked, in retrospect, like a person who had already arrived somewhere the rest of them had not yet gotten to. A person who knew how the story ended and had made, quietly and without announcement, her peace with it. This is the most difficult thing about Marceline Jones. Not the silence. Not the staying. But this, that by the end, she may not have been staying because she felt she had to. She may have been staying because she had decided, in whatever private reckoning she conducted in the years between the kitchen sink in Indianapolis and the medical clinic in Guyana, that this was her life, and these were her people, and wherever this went, she would go with it. That the community she had helped build, for all of what it had become, was still the closest thing to a life's work she had. That the man she had married, for all of what he had become, was still the man she had chosen. That leaving, at this point, was not survival. It was just a different kind of loss. And she had decided, or had arrived at the decision without quite deciding it, that she would rather lose everything at once than spend the rest of her life losing it in pieces. We cannot know if this is true. We cannot know what Marceline Jones thought in the final weeks and days and hours of her life, because she did not leave a record of it and because the people who were near her can only describe what they saw, which was a woman doing her work with the same competence and care she had always brought to it, right up until the end. What we know is that she knew. What we know is that she stayed. What we know is that she died in Jonestown at 51 years old, a nurse in a white uniform with a medical clinic organized the way she had organized it, in the jungle, in November, in the community she had given everything to. And what we are left with, decades later, is the question she never answered, not because she couldn't, but because some answers, once spoken, cannot be taken back. And Marceline Jones, who had been keeping the unspeakable thing inside for 20 years, understood better than anyone what it costs to say the true thing out loud. She had watched, from closer than anyone, what it had cost everyone who tried.